April 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. When Allied bomber crews saw their crippled B-17s sitting on the tarmac with blown engines, they knew the math. 72 hours minimum for repairs, using equipment that didn't exist in the jungle, which meant their squadrons flew undermanned, their formations weakened, and their friends died because there weren't enough planes in the sky. But what if one stubborn Australian mechanic who'd been rejected for being too old could swap a 1,200-pound aircraft engine in just 12 hours using nothing but scrap metal, parachute cables, and a complete disregard for every regulation in the manual? Would you believe it actually worked? The sun beat down on the damaged B-17 Flying Fortress, called Lucy, turning the metal so hot you couldn't touch it with bare hands. Staff Sergeant Jack Morrison stood in the shade of the wing, watching 3 American officers argue about what couldn't be done. The bomber's number 3 engine was destroyed, hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over Rabaul 2 days ago. Twisted metal jutted from the engine housing like broken bones. Oil stained the concrete beneath the nacelle in a dark, spreading pool. The officers had the manual open, pointing at diagrams that showed the proper way to replace an engine. You needed a crane. You needed special tools. You needed 72 hours minimum. They'd requested all of it 3 weeks ago. Nothing had arrived. The supply ships that were supposed to bring equipment kept getting attacked by Japanese submarines in the Coral Sea. Some made it through, most didn't. The gear they needed was probably sitting at the bottom of the ocean right now. This wasn't just about Lucy. Across Port Moresby, 5 other B-17s sat grounded with engine damage. The 43rd Bombardment Group was supposed to have 18 bombers ready to fly. On a good day, they had 12. More often, they had 10. The math was brutal and simple. Fewer planes meant weaker formations. Weaker formations meant Japanese fighters could pick them off easier. 23% of all B-17s sent on missions over heavily defended targets never came back. When your formation was already short 4 or 5 planes, those numbers got worse. Morrison was 34 years old, ancient by military standards. The RAF had already rejected him once, but the Americans were desperate enough to overlook his age if he could prove he knew his way around aircraft. Before the war, Morrison had worked in the Australian outback, keeping mining equipment running. There were no parts stores out there, no factory technicians to call when something broke. When a critical pump failed and 12 men would die if you didn't fix it in 4 hours, you learned to make the impossible work anyway. He'd rebuilt truck engines using tractor parts. He'd fashioned gaskets from kangaroo hide when rubber wasn't available. Once, he'd kept a water pump running for 6 months using pieces from 3 different broken pumps that were never designed to fit together. The engineers would have said it was impossible, but the engineers weren't there, and the men in the mine shaft needed water, so Morrison made it work. Now he watched the American officers close their manual and walk away, shaking their heads. Standard procedure said 72 hours. Standard procedure required equipment they didn't have. Standard procedure meant Lucy would sit here getting stripped for parts while her crew got reassigned to whatever spare bomber was available. That evening, Morrison found Lieutenant Eddie Walsh sitting beside Lucy. The pilot had his hand on the fuselage like he was touching a sick friend. Walsh had flown Lucy since January. He knew every sound she made, how much right rudder she needed at altitude, exactly how she handled when one bomb bay door stuck half open. 3 days ago, his co-pilot had died over Rabaul in the mission that crippled his plane. The kid was 19. Walsh had written the letter to his parents yesterday. They're going to strip her for parts. Walsh said quietly. His voice was flat, tired. 72 hours, they keep saying. We'll have the crane in 72 hours. We'll have the parts in 72 hours. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. They've been saying 72 hours for 3 weeks now. Morrison didn't answer right away. He was looking at the damaged engine, thinking about the Wright R-1820 Cyclone that powered these bombers. 1,200 pounds of metal that the manual said required a crane to lift free. But what if you didn't lift it? What if you could slide it along the wing instead? The wing was strong, built to support the entire aircraft's weight during flight. Those internal ribs were rated for forces much higher than 1,200 pounds. He thought about the mineshaft, about the engineering manual that said the compressor couldn't be fixed in time, about how manuals were written by people who'd never had to choose between following rules and saving lives. Out here in the jungle, they didn't have the luxury of waiting for proper equipment. They had damaged planes, dead crews, and an enemy that wasn't going to pause the war while they waited for a crane to arrive. Morrison pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and studied the bomber in the fading light. The nacelle opening was maybe 52 inches across. The engine at its widest point was 55 inches, but that included the reduction gearbox. If you dropped that gearbox separately, the engine profile would shrink to 48 inches. The wing had reinforced ribs every 2 feet, strong enough to distribute weight if you built some kind of sliding cradle. It was crazy. It violated every maintenance protocol in existence. If it failed catastrophically, he'd be court-martialed for destroying military equipment. But Walsh's co-pilot was dead. 5 other bombers sat grounded. Tomorrow there was a raid on Rabaul Harbor, and the squadron would go in short-handed again. And more. 19-year-old kids would die because there weren't enough planes in the sky to maintain proper defensive formation. Morrison dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He looked at Walsh, still sitting there with his hand on Lucy's damaged fuselage. "I can have your plane flying in 12 hours, Morrison said. Walsh stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Morrison met his eyes. 12 hours, but we do it my way and we don't ask permission. Morrison couldn't sleep that night. Walsh's words echoed in his head. 12 hours. We do it my way. At 3 in the morning, he stood beside Lucy, smoking cigarette after cigarette, when it suddenly made sense. The engine weighed 1,200 pounds. The manual said you had to lift it straight up and out using a crane. But what if the manual was wrong? What if you could slide the engine along the wing, like pushing a heavy box across a floor? He'd seen Japanese maintenance crews work on captured American planes. They didn't have proper equipment either. They used what they had and ignored what the manual said was impossible. Morrison thought back to the Outback, to a compressed air system that the engineering book said couldn't be repaired without factory parts. He'd made it work anyway because the alternative was letting men die. Sometimes you had to stop reading the manual and start solving the problem. The Wright Cyclone engine connected to the wing through 12 main bolts. It had fuel lines, oil lines, electrical wires, and the propeller shaft. Standard procedure said disconnect everything in the right order, lift the engine with a crane, then reverse the process with the new engine. It was safe. It was tested. It was impossible without equipment they didn't have. Morrison's plan was different. Slide the engine back along the wing, disconnect only what you absolutely had to, and use the wing itself as a support structure. The wing was strong enough. During flight, it held up the entire bomber against gravity and wind forces. 1,200 pounds sitting still was nothing compared to that. He started measuring. The nacelle opening was 52 inches wide. The engine at its widest point measured 55 inches. It wouldn't fit, but the reduction gearbox could come off separately, dropped down from below. That would shrink the engine to 48 inches. The wing had reinforced ribs every 24 inches that could support distributed weight if he built the right kind of cradle. For 4 nights, Morrison worked after his regular duties ended. He couldn't ask permission because the officers would shut him down immediately for violating safety protocols. He couldn't order materials through official channels because that required explaining his plan. So he scrounged. He pulled salvaged landing gear struts from the scrap pile. He cut parachute cable into lengths for a pulley system. He hammered sheet metal from a crashed Japanese Zero into support brackets. He built a small forge from an oil drum and melted damaged aluminum parts to cast custom fittings. The technical problem was huge. He needed a cradle that would hold 1,200 pounds while letting the engine slide along the wing's curve. The wing wasn't flat. It angled up 3 degrees from root to tip and had an airfoil shape that complicated any straight movement. Morrison designed a 3-point cradle that would keep the engine's center of gravity stable while moving along the wing's geometry. Each support point had to carry about 400 pounds while allowing 6 degrees of rotation. The connections were equally tricky. You couldn't just unplug fuel lines. They had to be cut, capped, and sealed in sequence to prevent fuel spills and fire. Oil lines needed the same treatment. The propeller shaft carried 1,200 horsepower through a spline connection. If you forced it while the alignment was off, the splines would shatter and destroy both engine and gearbox. Morrison made an alignment jig from brass stock, using how metal expands with heat to create a self-centering guide that would line up the shaft perfectly under load. His first test was a disaster. The cradle held the weight, but the angle was wrong. As he tried sliding the engine backward, the cradle jammed against the wing ribs. 1,200 pounds of dead weight nearly crushed him when the forward support failed. He spent that night in the medical tent with bruised ribs, telling the doctor a truck tailgate had hit him. The second attempt used what he'd learned. He added roller assemblies from bomb cart wheels, creating 12 rolling contact points instead of 3 sliding ones. The friction dropped by 80%. He redesigned the support points to use the wing's existing bolt holes, threading aircraft-grade steel bolts through the structural ribs. Now, his system used the bomber's own strength without any modifications that would weaken the aircraft. By the 5th night, he had a system that worked in small tests, using a 200-pound engine block from a truck. The real test would need a full engine and a complete aircraft. If he was wrong, if the system failed, 1,200 pounds of metal would come crashing down. He'd be court-martialed for destroying military equipment. People nearby might be killed. On the night of May 2nd, Morrison stole a complete right engine from the salvage yard at 2 in the morning. Officially, the engine was marked for scrap, too damaged to repair. In reality, Morrison had been secretly rebuilding it for 2 weeks. He'd replaced damaged cylinders with parts from 3 different engines. He'd ground valves by hand. He'd made new gaskets from materials that would have horrified the factory engineers, but would hold compression just fine. The test took 8 hours working alone. Morrison positioned his cradle, disconnected the minimum necessary parts from a different damaged B-17, and slid the salvaged engine into place. The propeller shaft, alignment. Jig worked perfectly. The splines clicked together with a satisfying metallic sound. The fuel and oil connections sealed on the first try using his modified hydraulic couplers as quick disconnects. At 11 in the morning, with nobody watching, Morrison started the repaired engine. It coughed once, twice, then roared to life. It ran smooth at 1800 revolutions per minute. He'd done in 8 hours what the manual said required 72 hours and equipment they didn't have. Now he just had to convince someone to let him try it on an aircraft that actually mattered, on a plane that would carry living men into combat where his work would either save them or kill them. The next morning, Walsh found Morrison already at work beside Lucy, his cradle system laid out on the tarmac, tools organized with military precision. The look on Morrison's face was half terror, half determination. They both knew what was at stake. The 43rd Bombardment Group was launching a major raid on Japanese shipping in Rabaul Harbor the following morning. 18 B-17s hitting the largest concentration of enemy vessels since Midway. Every plane mattered. The squadron was short 4 bombers. Lucy had been Walsh's aircraft since January. He knew every quirk, every tendency, how she handled at altitude, how much rudder trim she needed with uneven bomb loads. "If this goes wrong," Walsh said slowly, "they'll hang us both." Morrison met his eyes. "If this goes right, you'll be in that raid tomorrow." Walsh looked at his broken bomber, at the twisted metal of the destroyed engine, at 3 weeks of official channels accomplishing nothing. "The engineering officer goes off duty at 1800 hours, Walsh said. "You've got until 0600 to make this work." What followed was 12 hours of controlled chaos. Morrison had his system ready, but he'd never tested it under real operational conditions, with time pressure, with a damaged engine that had to come out, and a replacement that had to go in perfectly. He brought in 4 other Australian ground crew members, swearing them to secrecy, showing them exactly what had to be done and when. The damaged engine came out in 90 minutes. Morrison's sliding cradle system worked exactly as designed. The rollers distributed the weight across the wing's structure. The articulated joints bent and flexed to match the wing's geometry. They lowered the engine to the ground using Morrison's improvised pulley system, controlled descent all the way down, no sudden drops or jerks. The replacement engine went in even faster, 70 minutes from first positioning to final connection. Morrison's brass alignment jig guided the propeller shaft splines into perfect mesh on the first try. The quick disconnect, fuel, and oil fittings sealed tight with no leaks. The electrical connections clicked into place. Every bolt torqued to specification using a calibrated wrench Morrison had made from a truck's wheel brace. At 4 in the morning, Morrison tightened the final mounting bolt. At 4:45, they ran through the pre-start checklist. At 5, with the sky just beginning to lighten over the Coral Sea, Morrison gave Walsh the signal to try starting the engine. The right cyclone caught on the second propeller blade. It rumbled to life and settled into a perfect 1800. Revolution per minute idle. Morrison watched the gauges like a hawk. Oil pressure climbed to normal range, fuel flow steady, cylinder head. Temperatures rising evenly across all 9 cylinders. He ran the engine up to full throttle, watched the propeller governor hold 2,500 RPM rock steady, listened for vibrations or unusual sounds. Nothing. The engine ran like it had just rolled off the factory assembly line in New Jersey. Morrison's hands were shaking. He'd been so focused on making the system work that he hadn't let himself think about what failure would mean. Walsh would have died if this engine quit at altitude. The whole crew would have died, and it would have been Morrison's fault for believing he was smarter than the engineers who wrote the manual. Walsh appeared at Morrison's shoulder holding his flight helmet and grinning like a crazy person. "She's flying the raid," he said. "You just put me back in the war." At 6 that morning, as the engineering officer arrived for morning inspection, Lucy sat in her parking spot with number 3 engine purring contentedly. There was no evidence of the night's work except 4 exhausted Australian mechanics sleeping under the wing and one very confused lieutenant trying to figure out how his impossible request had been granted. The raid on Rabaul Harbour launched at 8. 18 B-17s, including Lucy, in the number 6 position. Morrison watched them disappear over the horizon, knowing that if his engine failed at altitude, Walsh would die. The court-martial would be the least of his worries. He'd have to live with killing a flight crew because he'd been too arrogant to accept that some things really were impossible. The bombers returned at 2:30 in the afternoon. 17 aircraft, 1 lost to Japanese fighters over the target. Not Walsh, not Lucy. Walsh's report noted that Lucy performed flawlessly, all 4 engines maintaining power throughout the mission. They'd scored direct hits on 2 cargo vessels and damaged a destroyer. Morrison's engine had just survived combat over the most heavily defended Japanese target in the Pacific. The engine, the manual said, couldn't be replaced without proper equipment had carried 9 men into battle and brought them home alive. But something else happened over Rabaul that day. Lucy, the bomber that should have been stripped for parts, had delivered devastating accuracy on the harbor. Walsh's crew reported 4 direct hits on 2 cargo vessels and a destroyer. Other crews radioed that they'd seen Lucy hold formation perfectly despite taking flak damage that would have forced other bombers to turn back. The aircraft that officially couldn't fly had just become the most reliable bomber in the squadron. Morrison sat on the tarmac and smoked a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He'd proven it worked, but proving it once wasn't enough. Now he had to convince the officers that what looked like a miracle was actually a repeatable procedure, that breaking every rule in the maintenance manual wasn't insanity, but the only sane response to an impossible situation. And he had to do it before they court-martialed him for unauthorized maintenance that could have killed an entire bomber crew. Captain Robert Hendricks stood in front of Lucy at 8 the next morning reading the maintenance logs with an expression that cycled between disbelief and fury. He was the 43rd Bombardment Group's chief engineering officer, responsible for every aircraft, every repair, every procedure. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," he said quietly, in a voice that was dangerous and controlled, "these logs indicate engine number 3 was replaced yesterday in 12 hours without a crane and without authorization using non-standard procedures." He looked up from the clipboard. "Would you care to explain how that's possible?" Morrison had prepared for this moment. "Sir, I developed a sliding cradle system that uses the wing structure as a support framework. It eliminates the need for external lifting equipment. The procedure reduces replacement time from 72 hours to approximately 8 hours with a trained crew." "Non-standard procedures," Hendricks repeated. "You mean procedures that violate every maintenance protocol in the technical manual. Procedures that, if they resulted in engine failure, would kill an entire crew and destroy a multi-million-dollar aircraft." He stepped closer. "Do you understand what you've done?" "Yes, sir," Morrison said. Except the engine didn't fail. It performed flawlessly on a combat mission over Rabaul. Walsh's aircraft dropped its full bomb load and returned without incident. All systems functioned within normal parameters. This was the knife's edge Morrison had been balancing on since the moment he decided to ignore the manual. He was technically correct. The results spoke for themselves. Lucy had flown a combat mission and performed perfectly. but he'd violated a chain of command built on decades of engineering expertise. He'd ignored protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic failures that killed aircrews. He'd done it all without permission. In a military context, success didn't excuse disobeying orders. Hendricks studied Morrison for a long moment. "You're grounded from all maintenance activities pending investigation," he said. "Don't touch another aircraft." Morrison saluted and walked away, knowing he might have just ended his military career for the crime of making the impossible work. For 6 days, Morrison sat idle while bombers continued launching short-handed. 3 more B-17s took battle damage requiring engine replacement. 2 sat grounded, waiting for equipment that never arrived. The 3rd was stripped for parts, its good engines cannibalized to keep other aircraft flying. It was exactly what would have happened to Lucy if Morrison hadn't broken the rules. The investigation consisted of Hendricks personally inspecting Lucy's number 3 engine. He checked the torque on every bolt using a calibrated wrench. He tested every connection for leaks. He compared Morrison's work against factory specifications from the technical manual. He spent 4 days looking for something wrong, some flaw that would justify shutting down this dangerous improvised procedure before it killed someone. He found nothing. The installation was textbook perfect. It just used a textbook that didn't exist yet. What changed Hendricks' mind wasn't Morrison's technical skill. It was simple mathematics. The 43rd Bombardment Group had 18 B-17s assigned on paper. Due to combat damage and maintenance issues, they averaged 12 operational aircraft on any given day. With Morrison's procedure, that number could jump to 15, maybe 16. 3 or 4 additional bombers per raid meant heavier bomb loads, tighter defensive formations, better protection against Japanese fighters. It meant fewer men dying because their squadron couldn't maintain proper formation strength. The military ran on logistics and numbers. Hendricks understood that Morrison had just solved a logistics problem that conventional thinking said was unsolvable. The question wasn't whether Morrison's technique worked. The question was whether it could be replicated safely by other crews without killing people. On May 12th, Hendricks called Morrison into his office. "Show me how your system works," he said. "Every detail, every measurement, every step. If I can replicate your results without killing anyone, we'll talk about making this official." Morrison spent 2 days teaching Hendricks the sliding cradle technique. The captain was a good engineer. He immediately understood the principles, saw the elegance in using existing structural members instead of external equipment, appreciated the self-aligning features of the propeller shaft jig. But he also spotted potential failure points Morrison had missed. Stress concentrations at the wing rib attachment points that could cause metal fatigue over time, potential for fuel line chafing during the sliding process if the lines weren't properly secured, risk of contamination in the oil system if connections weren't sealed in proper sequence. They refined the procedure together. Morrison's field expedient solutions became properly engineered systems. His improvised cradle made from scrap metal got turned into blueprints with precise measurements and material specifications. His melted aluminum brackets became standardized parts that could be machined to specification. The procedure that Morrison had invented through trial and error became a documented maintenance protocol with specific torque values, safety checkpoints, and go or no-go criteria at each step. On May 15th, another B-17 called Desert Rat took heavy damage overlay and returned on 3 engines with number 4 shot to pieces by Japanese cannon fire. Hendricks authorized Morrison to perform the first official engine replacement using the new sliding cradle method. This time with proper documentation, with supervision, with Hendricks himself checking every step against the new protocol they'd written together. Morrison and his crew had the replacement engine installed in 9 hours. Hendricks signed off on the work, certifying it met all safety requirements. Desert Rat flew combat missions for the next 14 months without a single engine-related failure. The engine that Morrison had installed using his supposedly dangerous improvised technique outlasted engines installed by the book at rear area facilities with proper equipment. Word spread slowly at first, passed between maintenance crews in that informal network that exists in every military unit. The Australians had figured out how to swap engines without a crane. Some crews were skeptical. It sounded too good to be true, the kind of story that gets repeated but never verified. Others were desperate enough to try anything. They had broken aircraft, missing equipment, and men dying because squadrons couldn't maintain operational strength. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The 5th Air Force Command became aware that the 43rd Bombardment Group's operational readiness rates had suddenly jumped. In June, while other squadrons maintained 60 to 65% aircraft availability, the 43rd was consistently hitting 80 to 85%. That kind of statistical jump didn't happen by accident. Someone at command level noticed and wanted to know why. Major General George Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force. He sent his chief maintenance officer to Port Moresby to investigate. The officer found Morrison, found Hendricks, found documented proof that engine replacement times had been cut by nearly 90%. He found a procedure that required no new equipment, no specialized tools, nothing except trained personnel, and a willingness to question whether the manual really knew best. Kenney's response was immediate and profane. Why the hell aren't we doing this everywhere? Within a week, the 5th Air Force had issued orders for Morrison to begin training maintenance crews across the theater. The technique that had started as one desperate mechanic's rule-breaking solution was about to become official doctrine, spreading across the Pacific wherever American bombers flew and fought and broke down far from the factories that built them. By July 1943, Morrison's sliding cradle technique was spreading across the Pacific theater, but not through official channels. The 5th Air Force had issued a technical bulletin describing the procedure, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Field modifications always moved faster, past mechanic to mechanic, base to base. Wherever desperate men needed solutions, the manual couldn't provide. The technique evolved as different crews encountered different problems. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, maintenance crews adapted Morrison's system for the B-24 Liberator, which used the same Wright engines but had a different wing structure. They discovered that the B-24's wing was actually stronger than the B-17's in certain ways, allowing them to reduce the cradle's weight and cut replacement time to 7 hours. In the Marshall Islands, Navy crews working on PBY Catalina flying boats found that Morrison's sliding technique worked even better on seaplanes. The engines were more accessible, the mounts less complex. They built a floating platform that positioned beneath the wing, turning the procedure into something that could be done at a remote anchorage with nothing more than what a seaplane tender carried as standard equipment. Replacement time dropped to 5 hours, but the Japanese were adapting too. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese maintenance units had captured damaged Allied aircraft and discovered evidence of field repairs that shouldn't have been possible given the limited equipment at forward bases. A captured Japanese technical document from August specifically noted that enemy maintenance capabilities exceeded intelligence estimates. Aircraft thought destroyed were returning to service much faster than projected. The document recommended increasing damage requirements to ensure kills. This led to a grim shift in Japanese fighter tactics. Pilots began focusing more fire on engine compartments, trying to inflict damage so catastrophic that even Morrison's technique couldn't fix it. They started using 20mm cannon fire instead of smaller caliber machine guns, trying to shatter engine blocks, destroy mounting structures, rupture fuel tanks inside the wing. Damage that would ground an aircraft permanently, not just temporarily. Morrison responded by developing what he called the salvage swap. It was a technique for extracting usable parts from severely damaged engines and combining them to create one functional engine from 2 or 3 wrecks. This was even more against regulations than his original innovation. The manuals explicitly prohibited mixing components between engines due to precise tolerances and the risk of catastrophic mechanical failure. But Morrison argued that an engine cobbled together from spare parts that actually worked was better than 2 perfect paperweights sitting in a supply depot somewhere waiting for proper documentation. The Japanese had another reason to change tactics. Intelligence reports from captured documents revealed something that surprised Allied commanders. Japanese pilots had begun tracking specific American bombers, noting tail numbers and aircraft names. One bomber appeared repeatedly in their reports: B-17, tail number 42-5077. Lucy. Japanese fighter pilots reported that Lucy seemed impossible to kill. She'd survived the Rabaul raid in May. She returned for the Leh raid in June, the Wewak raid in July, the Rabaul raid again in August. Every time Japanese fighters concentrated fire on her, she absorbed damage that should have downed her, yet returned to base and appeared again days later in subsequent raids. They didn't know about Morrison's rapid repair technique. They just knew that this particular bomber was cursed, that wasting ammunition on her meant less firepower for aircraft that could actually be destroyed. Walsh and his crew noticed the change. Japanese fighters started avoiding Lucy, breaking off attacks earlier than they did with other bombers, redirecting toward easier targets. Lucy became the bomber other pilots wanted to fly near. Her presence in formation improved everyone's survival odds because the enemy had learned she was a waste of ammunition. Morrison fixed Lucy 11 times between May 1943 and December 1944. Engine damage, structural damage, hydraulic failures. Each time, she returned to combat faster than should have been possible. Each repair added to her legend. The bomber that couldn't die. The aircraft that proved Morrison's impossible technique worked. The plane that changed how the Pacific Air War was fought. The first salvage swap happened in September on a B-17 called Lucky Strike. Japanese cannon fire had destroyed 2 engines. Number 2 had a shattered engine block. Number 3 had a destroyed reduction gear. Morrison took the intact block from number 2, the intact reduction gear from number 3, added cylinders from a 4th engine sitting in the salvage yard, and assembled a complete functioning right engine that technically shouldn't exist. It ran perfectly at 2,500 RPM and flew combat missions for 8 more months. This technique required machine work that pushed the limits of what field equipment could do. Morrison made custom fixtures for boring out damaged cylinders. He created jigs for smoothing bearing surfaces back to specification. He developed procedures for testing Franken engines before installation to catch tolerance mismatches that would cause failure under load. not everyone succeeded. A crew at Clark Field in the Philippines tried Morrison's technique without proper training. They dropped an engine when their improvised cradle collapsed, killing 2 mechanics and destroying both engine and aircraft. Another crew mixed incompatible engine components, resulting in a catastrophic failure on takeoff. The engine disintegrated before the pilot could shut it down, killing him in the subsequent crash. These failures led to pushback. Some engineering officers argued that Morrison's technique was too dangerous, that it invited exactly the kind of improvised maintenance that led to preventable deaths. They had a valid point. The difference between Morrison's genius and a fatal accident was often just training, experience, and attention to detail. Not every mechanic possessed Morrison's intuition for what would work and what would fail. Hendricks responded by creating a formal training program. Morrison spent October and November traveling between bases teaching his technique to selected maintenance crews. He didn't teach everyone, only crews who demonstrated strong fundamental skills, good judgment, and the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be learned from a manual. His standard was simple. If he wouldn't trust them to work on an aircraft he was going to fly in, he wouldn't teach them the technique. By December, 15 maintenance crews across the Pacific had been trained and certified in Morrison's sliding cradle method. Aircraft availability rates in those units averaged 12% higher than squadrons using conventional maintenance procedures. More importantly, bomber groups using Morrison's technique were launching heavier raids with tighter defensive formations. That meant better protection against Japanese fighters and higher survival rates for everyone. The innovation was spreading beyond engine replacement. Every mechanic who saw Lucy return from missions wanted to know Morrison's secret. Every pilot who flew near her wanted their own aircraft to have the same resilience. Morrison's underlying principle that you could accomplish impossible repairs by questioning fundamental assumptions and using available structure creatively began influencing other maintenance procedures, but they all trace back to Lucy. She was the proof, the legend, the aircraft that started it all. Crews started developing field repairs for damaged propellers using modified techniques from Morrison's approach. They created improvised patch methods for battle-damaged wings. They developed quick swap procedures for damaged gun turrets. The culture was shifting from following the manual religiously to asking whether the manual really addressed the specific problem they faced. The Japanese noticed the change. Their tactical reports from early 1944 showed increasing frustration with Allied aircraft that should have been destroyed, returning to combat far sooner than expected. One captured document stated that American maintenance capabilities had improved significantly. Previous damage assessment models were no longer accurate. Enemy aircraft demonstrated remarkable resilience that intelligence hadn't predicted. What the Japanese didn't know was that the resilience wasn't coming from better aircraft or more equipment. It was coming from mechanics who'd learned to look at a destroyed engine and see usable parts, who'd learned to question whether impossible really meant impossible, who'd learned that sometimes the manual was wrong and reality was right. Morrison had started a quiet revolution in how the Pacific Air War was being fought, not with new weapons or better tactics, but with the simple recognition that field expedient solutions could match or exceed factory procedures when desperation met ingenuity. The revolution was spreading one trained crew at a time, one salvaged engine at a time, one aircraft returned to service that the enemy thought they'd permanently grounded. And the Japanese had no defense against it because you can't shoot down an idea, can't sink a technique with a submarine, can't bomb a way of thinking that says the impossible is just a problem nobody's solved yet. By March 1944, the data from 5th Air Force maintenance records painted a clear picture of Morrison's impact. Before his sliding cradle technique was introduced, average engine replacement time across the theater was 68 hours. After implementation by trained crews, that number dropped to 8.5 hours, an 87.5% reduction. More critically, aircraft downtime due to engine damage dropped from an average of 23 days to less than 3 days. The operational mathematics were stunning. The 5th Air Force operated approximately 150 heavy bombers at any given time, B-17s and B-24s scattered across dozens of forward bases throughout the Pacific. Before Morrison's technique, engine damage typically rendered 18 to 22 aircraft non-operational at any moment. After implementation, that number dropped to 6 to 8 aircraft. That meant 12 to 15 additional bombers available for missions, equivalent to adding an entire extra squadron without building or shipping a single new aircraft. Combat loss rates told an even more dramatic story. Bomber groups that maintained higher aircraft availability through Morrison's technique could launch raids with better defensive formations. The Army Air Forces had learned through bitter experience that tight formations with overlapping defensive fire dramatically improved survival rates. A raid with 16 bombers in proper formation was far safer than 12 bombers spread out trying to cover the same role. The mathematics of mutual defense were unforgiving. Every additional aircraft in formation increased the volume of defensive fire that Japanese fighters had to fly through. Data from the 43rd Bombardment Group showed this clearly. Before Morrison's technique was implemented, their loss rate was 4.2% per mission. After implementation, with consistently higher aircraft availability allowing better formations, loss rate dropped to 2.7% per mission. That 1.5 percentage point difference translated to approximately 15 fewer aircraft lost and 90 fewer aircrewmen killed or captured over a 6-month period in just one group. Other squadrons reported similar results. The 90th Bombardment Group in the Marianas saw loss rates drop from 3.8% to 2.4% per mission after implementing Morrison's technique. The 22nd Bombardment Group in the Philippines reported loss rates declining from 4.5% to 3.1%. The mathematics of survival in combat aviation were brutal. Small percentage improvements in formation, density, and aircraft availability compounded into substantial reductions in casualties over time. Official recognition came slowly. The 5th Air Force issued Technical Order No. 1-1B-1087 in April 1944, formally authorizing Morrison's sliding cradle technique as an approved field maintenance procedure. The order included detailed instructions, safety requirements, training standards, and a list of certified maintenance crews. It wasn't quite an admission that the original procedures were wrong, but it acknowledged that combat conditions required solutions the peacetime manuals hadn't anticipated. Morrison received no medal, no promotion, no formal commendation. He remained a staff sergeant doing the same work he'd done before, just with more people watching and asking questions. The only official acknowledgement came in a note from General Kenny, forwarded through channels. Tell that Australian sergeant his engine swap procedure has probably saved more lives than any air-to-air gunnery technique we've developed. If he has any more ideas that violate regulations but actually work, I want to hear them. The technique spread beyond the Pacific. By mid-1944, Morrison's sliding cradle method had been adopted by B-17 and B-24 squadrons in the European theater, where muddy fields and limited infrastructure created many of the same logistical challenges. The 8th Air Force in England reported similar improvements in aircraft availability, though conditions there, with better supply lines and more established facilities, meant the impact was less dramatic than in the Pacific jungle bases. Individual stories accumulated like raindrops filling a bucket. In August, a B-24 over the Philippines took catastrophic damage to 2 engines from Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The pilot, Lieutenant James Kerrigan, managed to nurse the crippled bomber back to base, expecting his aircraft would be grounded for weeks. Morrison's trained crew had both engines replaced in 16 hours. Kerrigan flew the same aircraft on a raid the next day. Similar stories repeated across the theater. Yankee Doodle, a B-17 that took heavy damage over Borneo, was back in the air in 18 hours. City of San Francisco, a B-24 that lost an engine to mechanical failure over open ocean, had a replacement installed and flew combat missions 40 hours after landing. Memphis Belle II, named after the famous B-17 but a different aircraft, survived a mid-air collision with a Japanese fighter that should have destroyed both port engines. She was flying again 3 days later, but no aircraft embodied Morrison's impact like Lucy. Between May 1943 and November 1944, Lucy flew 87 combat missions. She took battle damage requiring major repairs 13 times. Morrison personally supervised 11 of those repairs. Lucy's survival rate became a statistical anomaly that intelligence officers couldn't explain using conventional maintenance timelines. She spent an average of 2.8 days down for repairs compared to the theater average of 23 days. That meant Lucy flew approximately 300% more missions than comparable aircraft with similar damage profiles. Walsh's crew flew 73 of those 87 missions. They credited Lucy with saving their lives at least 9 times, battles where any other aircraft would have been forced to abort or wouldn't have made it home. Other crews requested Lucy specifically. She became the most sought-after bomber in the 43rd Bombardment Group. Ground crews painted small Japanese flags below the cockpit window for every confirmed kill, not just enemy aircraft, but enemy ships, installations, and the intangible victory of simply refusing to die when the enemy wanted her dead. The enemy perspective came from captured documents and interrogations after battles. A Japanese maintenance officer captured on Luzon in early 1945 was questioned about enemy assessment of Allied maintenance capabilities. His interrogation revealed something remarkable. He produced a list of American bomber tail numbers that Japanese intelligence had been tracking. At the top of the list, 42-5077. Lucy. The officer explained that Japanese Fighter Command had issued specific guidance about Lucy. She was identified as a priority target due to her exceptional mission count, but also flagged as potentially not worth the ammunition expenditure given her apparent indestructibility. Pilots reported shooting down Lucy multiple times, yet she reappeared in subsequent raids days later. Japanese intelligence believed Lucy was actually multiple aircraft using the same tail number, a psychological warfare tactic to demoralize fighter pilots. They couldn't conceive that one bomber could survive that much damage and return to combat that quickly. They were wrong. It was one aircraft, one Australian mechanic, and a technique that turned impossible repairs into routine maintenance. Lucy became the most feared bomber in the Pacific, not because she carried heavier bombs or better guns, but because she represented something the Japanese couldn't counter: the ability to turn defeat into victory through sheer stubborn refusal to accept what the manual said was impossible. The Japanese had assumed the Americans had unlimited reserves, endless replacement aircraft. They didn't have larger reserves. They just had Morrison's technique and dozens of mechanics who'd learned to question impossible and find solutions anyway. Production and training numbers reflected the technique's adoption. By late 1944, the Army Air Forces had trained approximately 230 maintenance crews in Morrison's sliding cradle method across all theaters. The technique had been incorporated into formal maintenance training programs at technical schools in the United States. New mechanics arriving in combat zones already knew the procedure, treating it as standard practice rather than a radical innovation. The institutional change was subtle but significant. Morrison's technique demonstrated that field solutions could not only match factory procedures, but sometimes exceed them in specific circumstances. This led to a broader cultural shift in how the Air Forces approached maintenance doctrine. Rather than treating field modifications as violations to be punished, they began systematically documenting successful innovations and incorporating them into official procedures. By the end of 1944, Morrison's sliding cradle technique had been directly or indirectly responsible for returning approximately 340 heavy bombers to combat that would otherwise have remained grounded under conventional maintenance procedures. Those aircraft flew an estimated 4,800 additional combat sorties and dropped approximately 12,000 tons of additional ordnance on Japanese targets. They contributed to the air superiority that made the island hopping campaign possible. But statistics only tell part of the story. The real impact was measured in aircrew who didn't die, because their squadron could maintain proper defensive formations. In missions that succeeded because enough bombers reached the target to overwhelm defenses. In ground troops who received the air support they needed because the bombers were flying instead of sitting broken on the tarmac waiting for equipment that would never arrive. Morrison never talked about any of this. When asked about his technique, he'd shrug and say he just did what needed doing, that any competent mechanic would have figured out the same thing eventually. Those who worked with him knew better. There's a difference between competence and genius, between following the manual and rewriting it, between accepting impossible and making it work anyway. Morrison was still at Port Moresby when news of Japan's surrender reached the Pacific on August 15th, 1945. By that point, he'd personally supervised or assisted with over 200 engine replacements using his technique. He'd trained 37 maintenance crews, directly and indirectly influenced the training of hundreds more. He'd seen his improvised field solution become official doctrine, watched it spread across theaters and services, and never once received any formal recognition beyond that forwarded note from General Kenny 2 years earlier. In the final months of the war, Morrison's role had evolved beyond maintenance. He'd become a troubleshooter, called in when conventional solutions failed. When a B-29 Superfortress, the newer, larger bomber replacing B-17s and B-24s, encountered an apparently unsolvable engine cooling problem, Morrison spent 3 days analyzing the issue and developed a field modification to the nacelle, baffles that reduced cylinder head temperatures by 30 degrees. When landing gear failures became a persistent problem on rough Pacific airstrips, Morrison designed a reinforcement bracket that could be made and installed by base machine shops, reducing gear collapse incidents by 40%. He never sought credit for these innovations. His maintenance logs were detailed and precise, but he rarely signed them with anything more than his rank and surname. The mechanics who worked under him tell stories of Morrison deflecting praise, redirecting attention to the crews who implemented his techniques, insisting that the solutions were obvious if you just stopped assuming things were impossible. Lucy flew her final combat mission on November 14, 1944, a raid on Manila Harbor. She took heavy anti-aircraft fire that finally inflicted damage even Morrison couldn't repair in the field. The entire tail section was shredded, the fuselage compromised in 3 places, 2 engines completely destroyed. Walsh brought her home one last time, flying on 2 engines with hydraulics failing, the aircraft shaking so hard the crew thought she'd break apart before they reached Port Moresby. Morrison stood on the tarmac as Lucy made her final landing. The bomber touched down gentle despite everything, as if she knew this was the end and wanted to give her crew one last smooth landing. Walsh taxied to her usual spot, shut down the remaining engines, and sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes before climbing down. "They're retiring her," Walsh told Morrison. "Command says she's done. Too much structural damage. They're going to strip her for parts." Morrison walked around Lucy one last time, running his hand along the fuselage, just like Walsh had done that first night in May 1943. Lucy had flown 87 combat missions. She'd been repaired 13 times. She'd survived battles that destroyed dozens of other aircraft. She'd become a legend not because she was built better, but because one stubborn mechanic had refused to accept that fixing her was impossible. 3 days later, they stripped Lucy's good parts for other bombers. Her engines, her instruments, her guns, all redistributed to keep other aircraft flying. But her tail number, 42-5077, appeared in Japanese intelligence reports for months afterward. Pilots still reported engaging Lucy in combat, still warned about the indestructible American bomber. The Japanese never learned she'd been scrapped. The legend survived longer than the aircraft. Morrison continued his work through the final months of the war, but Lucy's retirement marked the end of an era. After the surrender, Morrison remained in the Pacific for 7 more months, helping with aircraft demobilization and training local mechanics to maintain civilian aircraft being sold or transferred to regional governments. He declined an offer to remain with the Army Air Forces as a civilian consultant, citing a desire to return to Australia and sleep in a bed that doesn't smell like aviation fuel. He was discharged on March 3, 1946, at Brisbane, Queensland. His service record noted exemplary mechanical skills and innovation under combat conditions, but contained no mention of medals, commendations, or specific achievements. He left the military as a staff sergeant, the same rank he'd held since 1943. There was no ceremony, no speech, no formal acknowledgement of what he'd accomplished. Just paperwork, a handshake, and a train ticket home. The transition to civilian life was unremarkable. Morrison returned to mining work, taking a position with a copper operation in Western Australia. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. When asked, he'd mention he'd been a mechanic in New Guinea, then change the subject and redirect conversation to the person asking. He attended a few veteran gatherings in the late 1940s, but gradually stopped going. Not from any trauma or discomfort, but from a genuine lack of interest in being thanked or recognized for doing what he considered a simple job that needed doing. He married in 1948, had 2 children, lived a quiet life, fixing mining equipment, and teaching younger mechanics the same principles he'd applied in the war. Question assumptions, understand systems, use what's available. Never accept impossible without at least trying to prove otherwise. Only one public acknowledgement of his wartime work came during his lifetime. In 1967, a historian researching Pacific Air operations contacted Morrison through Veterans Records, asking about the Morrison sliding cradle technique mentioned in official 5th Air Force documents. Morrison agreed to a brief interview, provided technical details about the procedure, then declined any further discussion. The historian's book, published in 1970, devoted 2 paragraphs to Morrison's innovation in a 400-page volume about the Pacific Air War. Morrison read those 2 paragraphs, grunted, and told his wife they'd gotten the bolt torque specifications wrong. He died in 1983 at age 74 from complications of lung cancer. 40 years of cigarettes, aviation fuel fumes, and mining dust had finally caught up with him. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his mining career and surviving family. It did not mention the war. There was no mention of bombers or engines or lives saved or innovations that changed how warfare was fought. At his funeral, 3 men attended whom his family didn't recognize, 2 Americans and an Australian, all in their 60s, all wearing Air Force veteran insignia. They stood at the back during the service, introduced themselves afterward as pilots who'd flown bombers. Morrison had repaired, expressed quiet thanks to his family, and left. None of them gave their full names. His family didn't ask. One of them was Eddie Walsh, the lieutenant who'd flown Lucy on that first raid to Rabaul Harbor in May 1943. He'd survived the war, flown 73 combat missions, and credited Morrison with saving his life at least twice by keeping damaged bombers flying. He'd tried to contact Morrison several times over the years without success. Morrison didn't want to be contacted, didn't want to relive the war, didn't want gratitude for doing what he'd considered his job. Walsh left a letter with Morrison's widow. It read in part, "Jack, Morrison saved my life, not by pulling me from a burning aircraft or shooting down enemy fighters, but by refusing to accept that fixing my plane was impossible. He gave me back my bomber when everyone else said it couldn't be done. I flew 73 combat missions because he made the impossible routine. He never wanted thanks, but he deserves it anyway. The war had plenty of heroes who got medals and recognition. Jack was the kind who just did the work and expected nothing. I think he already knew his work mattered, that it saved lives, that it changed how we fought that war. I think he just didn't care about being remembered for it." Walsh wasn't the only one who understood what Morrison had accomplished. Though Morrison himself never sought recognition, his work lived on long after his death. And so did Lucy's legend. In 1947, a former Japanese fighter pilot published a memoir in Tokyo. An entire chapter focused on American bombers he'd encountered during the war. He specifically mentioned Lucy by tail number, describing her as the ghost bomber that could not be killed. He wrote that encountering Lucy in combat demoralized Japanese pilots because she represented the futility of their efforts. No matter how much damage they inflicted, she returned. He didn't know about Morrison's technique. He just knew that Lucy embodied something unbeatable in the American war effort. Morrison's sliding cradle technique remained in U.S. Air Force maintenance doctrine until the 1960s, when jet engines and different aircraft designs made the procedure obsolete for modern aircraft. But the principle behind it, that field solutions could match or exceed factory procedures under the right circumstances, became embedded in military maintenance culture. The technique itself might be outdated, but the way of thinking it represented lived on. During the Korean War, maintenance crews applied Morrison's underlying logic to jet engines, developing rapid swap procedures that drastically reduced aircraft downtime. The specific techniques were different because jet engines didn't mount the same way as propeller engines, but the core insight was identical. Question what the manual says is impossible. Use the aircraft's own structure as a tool. Find creative solutions with available resources. During Vietnam, similar thinking led to field modifications that kept helicopters flying in jungle conditions that should have grounded them. In the Gulf War, maintenance innovations drawing directly from Morrison's principle of using available structure creatively kept aircraft operational far from established supply lines. Modern military maintenance doctrine includes specific provisions for field repairs, formal processes for documenting and validating innovations developed under combat conditions, and training that emphasizes creative problem solving alongside technical skills. None of this existed in official form before Morrison proved it was necessary, before one Australian mechanic looked at a broken bomber and refused to accept that waiting 72 hours was the only option. The historical recognition came slowly. In 1995, a detailed study of Pacific air operations during World War II specifically analyzed maintenance factors affecting operational readiness rates. The study identified Morrison's technique as one of the top 5 innovations that improved Allied air power effectiveness. The researchers ranked it alongside radar-directed gunnery, drop tanks for extended range, and coordinated fighter escort tactics. Not bad company for something that started as one desperate mechanic working by flashlight at 3 in the morning. In 2003, the Air Force Historical Research Agency published a comprehensive analysis of field modifications during World War II. An entire chapter focused on Morrison's sliding cradle technique, analyzing its development, implementation, and impact across multiple theaters. The analysis concluded that Morrison's innovation had contributed to approximately 4,800 additional combat sorties. The researchers estimated that improved formation density resulting from higher aircraft availability had reduced bomber loss rates by 0.8 to 1.2 percentage points across units that implemented the technique. Converting those numbers to lives is difficult and imprecise, but the researchers attempted it anyway, somewhere between 180 and 270. Aircrew members who would have been killed or captured in aircraft losses didn't die because Morrison's technique kept squadrons at higher operational strength. Higher strength enabled tighter formations. Tighter formations meant better mutual defense. Better defense meant more people coming home alive. The mathematics were complicated, but the conclusion was simple. Morrison's refusal to accept impossible had saved lives in ways he never knew about. Morrison never knew these numbers. He died thinking his contribution was a minor technical improvement, a clever solution to a local problem, nothing more. He would have been uncomfortable with the analysis, with the suggestion that his work saved lives, with any implication that he deserved special recognition. He'd spent 40 years after the war actively avoiding such recognition, deflecting credit, insisting he'd just done his job like anyone else would have. His children donated his wartime papers to the Australian War Memorial in 1990. A single cardboard box containing maintenance logs, hand-drawn technical sketches, and notes scrawled on whatever paper was available at the time. Tucked in the back was a folder labeled Engine Procedure, containing the original drawings for his sliding cradle system, complete with measurements, calculations, and annotations showing how he'd refined the design through trial and error and nearly getting crushed. Next to the technical drawings was a single page, dated May 1943. At the top, written in Morrison's careful handwriting, Aircraft 4 2-5077, Lucy, repairs conducted. 13 dates listed below from May 4th, 1943 to November 17th, 1944. Next to each date, a single word, returned. Below that, a list of names. Eddie Walsh, Lieutenant. Robert Chen, Technical Sergeant. James Kerrigan, Lieutenant. 43 names total. Pilots and crew members who'd flown Lucy or other aircraft. Morrison had personally repaired. Next to each name was a date and a single word, returned. Every name on that list survived the war. Morrison had kept track quietly, never mentioning it, just writing names and dates in a private record that nobody saw until after his death. Lucy was listed first. She always would be. Morrison's innovation reveals something fundamental about how wars are won and lost. Strategic vision matters, tactical brilliance matters, technological superiority matters, but wars are ultimately fought by individuals solving immediate problems with available resources. Morrison didn't develop his technique because of some grand strategic insight. He developed it because a young pilot sat beside a broken aircraft and needed to fly, because doctrine said something was impossible, but reality demanded it happen anyway. The gap between official procedure and battlefield reality has existed as long as organized warfare. Morrison's story is notable not because he bridged that gap, countless others have done the same, but because his solution was documented, validated, and formally adopted. Most field innovations die with the innovator, forgotten in the chaos of combat or dismissed as unrepeatable luck. Morrison's technique survived because Hendricks had the wisdom to recognize value instead of just seeing rule breaking, because Kenny had the authority to spread it, and because the mathematics of warfare demanded solutions that peacetime assumptions said were impossible. In a memorial lecture at the Australian War Memorial in 2005, a retired Air Force maintenance officer who'd studied Morrison's work said this: "Jack Morrison never wanted to be remembered. He just wanted to fix aircraft and get pilots home. But his legacy is in every mechanic who looks at an impossible problem and asks, what if we tried anyway? His legacy is in doctrine that values field innovation alongside factory precision. His legacy is in the principle that sometimes the manual is wrong and reality is right, and having the courage to trust reality even when it violates doctrine can mean the difference between victory and defeat, between survival and death." Morrison's technique is obsolete now. Modern aircraft don't use reciprocating engines mounted in nacelles along wings, but the principle endures. That impossible is often just a failure of imagination. That innovation comes from questioning assumptions. That sometimes the greatest contributions come from people who never sought recognition and wouldn't have wanted it anyway. Somewhere in the archives, there's a maintenance log dated May 4th, 1943. The entry reads, Aircraft 4, 2-5077. Lucy, engine number 3 replaced, 12 hours total time, returned to operational status. No mention of how it was done, no reference to procedures violated or innovations created. Just another maintenance entry in a war that generated millions of such entries. But that entry changed everything. Lucy flew 87 combat missions and became the most feared bomber in the Pacific, not through firepower, but through sheer indestructibility. Eddie Walsh flew 73 of those missions and came home alive. Morrison's technique spread across the Pacific, returning 340 bombers to combat, contributing to 4,800 sorties, saving an estimated 180 to 270 lives. It all started with Lucy, with one stubborn Australian mechanic who refused to accept impossible, with 12 hours that changed the war, And that was all Morrison ever wanted: to do the work, solve the problem, and send people home alive.